So here's a note. I saw this from Mike Craven, who writes for Dave Campbell's Texas Football Magazine, and it made me think, and we've seen this before, and this is a lazy narrative. Let him finish his thought here. Talking Big 12 football reveals the ball knowers from the ball pretenders. And he goes on to talk about how the conference, in some ways, is still referred to as a pass-happy conference without any defense, and using the phrase basketball on grass, track meet, etc., which is so far from what they've become because of a lot of the different coaches who have entered this conference and the way the styles of teams. There are still some that are wide open. We get that. But I thought that was a great point by Mike Craven.
Well, it's one of those things that there was a time, yes, where everybody but a couple schools were wide open offenses. But now, I mean, you look at the Big 12 conference, and I don't think you can paint this conference with this is how everything works brush, right? So, or how everybody does things, because it's so big now. Utah's not a spread team. Arizona State don't really know. I mean, Kansas and Kansas State aren't spread teams. Kansas is a wide zone. Kansas State's not a spread. Oklahoma State kind of is. TCU is. Tech is. UCF is Gus Malzahn's thing, so that's not really basketball on grass. I've never thought of it that way. I mean, that's kind of an old it's an SEC offense. West Virginia's not that way. Iowa State's certainly not. Willie Fritz is not. Colorado is. Cincinnati's not. BYU's not. Baylor is again. So, everybody's kind of different in the league, which is part of the reason why it's going to be so damn challenging for anybody, because you're not facing the same game plans every single week like maybe you were back in the 2010s.
Yeah, this is actually a different Mike Craven tweet than the one I was expecting. He had another one that was talking about, I guess he had, you come across whoever you come across on Twitter, and he was talking about, like, what happened to the game I love when instead of just talking trash, like, you're comparing TV ratings. And I've foreshadowed this. You can go back to like 2 years ago when I started talking about TV ratings and what I said was going to happen, right? And like we're seeing it happen in real time. It's just, I could see that coming when that became kind of another subtopic that caught a little bit of fire. So that's where I thought you were going to go, and that in itself is an interesting conversation. So in regards to this one in particular, yeah, I mean, quite frankly, if there's anybody still saying that in 2024, you need to cut off like them as a source or a faucet of college football knowledge for you when it comes to the Big 12. Like, they need to be banned, unfollowed, whatever, because that hasn't been the case for several years now. Like, when that was the case and that was at its peak, do y'all realize that was a decade ago?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. That was a decade ago.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
That was a decade ago that we were talking about the track on, the football field and Art Briles' offenses at Baylor and what TCU was doing with Trayvon Boykin and that whole crew of folks.
Casey Paha, yeah.
That was 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Texas Tech, they're still a mold of themselves in some ways, but when they were at like their peak, Cliff Kingsbury, that was 10 years ago. It hasn't been that way for a really long time. Yeah, there's been teams here and there that continue to do it or have incorporated it, have done it to some extent, but I'd say for the past 2 or 3 years, it's been a very run-heavy conference, defensive, and the only other part to that you didn't mention was, they don't play defense either. It's track on the football field, and they don't play defense. I guess the defensive thing's gone away, but the idea that, yeah, it's just everybody scores 60, like when Geno was at West Virginia taking on, Briles and RG3 and these crazy, types of 60-plus point offenses. We'll see some teams post 60, like, maybe more than once this season. Not likely in the conference, but in the non-conference and whatnot. But, like, the days of that being commonplace week in and week out in multiple games across, that's been dead for 10 years. I mean, it maybe not quite 10, but close to 10 years. So anybody that's still saying that at this point have absolutely no idea what they're talking about.
Well, it's also a conference. Remember when we showed the Doak Walker list that there are a chunk of running backs up for that. There were running backs that were up for that award too, but you're right. This is a different personality of a conference.
Well, part of the thing that's happened is the advent of the 3-3-5 defense. That wasn't a defense that everybody was running. West Virginia started running it. Other people. Iowa State, West Virginia. Iowa State started running it.
That's who everybody has copied, basically, is defending it.
Yeah, Iowa State started running the 3-3-5, and so the spreads, even the ones that were the Texas Tech, Zach Kigley types offenses, have had to morph to deal with that, because now you always have 5 defensive backs in the field. You've got a third linebacker that's really a safety, so you're kind of playing dime all the time. And even then, it gives you a lot of different flexibility. So I think that people who haven't noticed that part of it, especially noticed that outside of Texas's really high-flying offense last year that wound up winning the conference, and now they're on to the SEC. But, Baylor and Oklahoma State, when they played, that was a slobber knocker offensive game. It wasn't like, this old school that it would have been Braden Whedon versus Bryce Petty kind of an offense.
You guys think that Texas is wide open?
Well, I mean, like, they had huge offensive numbers,
No,
but they
okay,
weren't.
yeah, because I don't think of them as an air raid team.
No,
not air raid, but they're spread, and you can incorporate other like when the people that were talking about the Big 12, that was when the conference was like basically like 7 of the 12 were air raid systems.
Yeah, no, I get it.
So that's not what it is now, and that's not what it's been for a while. Like, since Browse got fired and TCU had some changeover from their like. We're not in 2014. That's the point.
Yeah.
And so, a lot has shifted, and some of that stayed, but a lot of it got handled by the Iowa States of the world, making changes on defense that now I think every single school has adapted in some way. I know Baylor did. Under Matt Rule, they started copying what Iowa State was doing to some extent. Who did we talk to at Big 12 Media Days? They said it was one of the new schools. They were like, well, we've been looking – I think it was like Cincinnati's like, well, we've been looking at the 3-3-5. It's like, yeah, that's what everybody does in the Big 12 because that's what started working, and everybody's kind of copied that to the point of, well, now you can't do all that the same way, and so now we're going to shift a little bit more towards being run-heavy. And I think that's bared out to where, it's been much more of a defensive conference and a running conference with a sprinkling of the other stuff too. But, I think that's also, there's been no Patrick Mahomes or Bryce Petty or Trayvon Boykin or the litany of quarterbacks that were kind of tearing it up and the combinations of receivers and QBs that you had back. It's just a different game than it was. And so, that, if that comment's still going around, I think that tells you all you need to know. And if you hear the other side of that, which thankfully Mike did mention, but they don't play defense in the Big 12. I don't think that's been the case for at least 3 or 4 years now at this point either. So that's an easy tactic to spot who doesn't really know what they're talking about.
Craig, this is a personal note that you'll remember. This is when that 3-3-5 really started to have some traction, even back in the early 2000s, when Reggie McNeil was at Lufkin High School. And they used to throw that deep fade all the time. Who was the quarterback from Lufkin, Paul, that came here to Baylor? Parks, right?
Yeah, Terrence Parks.
Terrence Parks. And they used to just throw that fade. And what happened is Lee High School started to play the 3-3-5, and it started to frustrate that offense. And that was 20 years ago. But that's when I first really saw any kind of impact of what it could do. Doesn't mean you're still going to stop an offense with those type of weapons. But I remember when Randy Huffstickler and Jay Law, high school coaches, noticed that it was creating a little bit of a logjam for those offenses back then.
Yeah, and that we've had 2 decades plus now of spread in Texas high school football, and all levels of eyes having seen it to some degree, even some of the tentacles reaching the NFL. And so there's been 2 decades to try and thwart it and fend it off, and there's been some cases where it's been effective, like Iowa State, and that's why so many people have copied what they've done by the years. But I think some of it too is just the talent level, the coaching turnover for sure. I mean, like I mentioned Texas Tech. Joey McGuire's not a big air raid, like throw it all over the field type. He wants to run the football, and that wasn't always the case at Tech, where Patrick Mahomes wasn't getting to a bowl game, but he was damn sure throwing it 60 times per game. That's not where we have been for quite a while now. It makes me look back on it a little bit fondly, because those were games that could really turn into headaches if you loved any kind of defense, but the offenses were incredible. I mean,
Timothy Green, you're right. Timothy Green, West Virginia started that 3-3-5 themselves in 2005. Geno Smith never played against RG3. However, we did score that 70-63.
That's what I was thinking of,
against Baylor. That was in 2012. Was Nick Florence.
Yeah, I didn't think it was RG3 when I said that. I knew it was in the ballpark. But that's the game people refer to. And look, if whoever wants credit for it, I mean, I just know that Iowa State's the one here recently that, going back to Matt Rule when he was here, which is now like 6-7 years ago.
He's been gone
He
since
was talking about
2000.
Matt Campbell, the Media Days interview with, I think it was Satterfield, was talking about Matt Campbell and Iowa State. But, yeah, West Virginia deserves some credit and on both ends of the spectrum, the offensive side of this and the defensive side of this.
Here are some other stories that we'll kind of chip away at. We do have a nice guest list, including Carter Carls, who covers A&M on the running back room, along with Brian Haydad, who covers Mississippi State. Tim Brando today joins us on the show. Ari Temkin from Big 12 Radio and John McClain, Hall of Fame columnist. The battle for the Iron Skillet, TCU and SMU, that has been a kick time that is officially there now. It's going to be 3 o'clock. They will play September 21st on the CW Network. And, of course, we're on the CW Network with our show at night when it's a replay. But that's TCU and SMU, 3 o'clock on September 21st.
I mean, everybody's making the CW jokes now. You almost can't even do it. It's too low-hanging fruit to talk about how that comes on, in between the Gilmore Girls and, whatever else. Like, every joke's made every time the CW is brought up now. But, shoot, for all we know, Big 12 might occupy some territory on that network at some point in time or any other conference because they're clearly in the sports game. And so, hey, if you're those involved, I'm really interested to see what that product looks like. CW just went and got WWE NXT. They're going to debut that this fall, so they're investing, and I think that's a platform that you look at that maybe invests a little bit further if this goes well. So that's something to note for, I think, all college programs. And that's going to be an interesting game this year. I mean, SMU's obviously feeling themselves, and rightfully so, moving into the ACC. They've got a good team, and TCU, there's no love lost there. They expect to be a pretty good team, and those have been some competitive, fun games. So I think that ought to be I don't know how many people are going to watch it, but I think that ought to be a hell of an entertaining game.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the CW, look, it's in 90% or more of the markets in the country. There's a CW, and people, because they're not nerds like me, don't know this, but Smokey, you remember because you were in TV when people having cable was kind of a 50-50 deal, but you probably had in most markets, you had a CBS, ABC, NBC, and then randomly there was like a Fox, and Fox was really not much, like for a while, like in the late 80s, early 90s, it started to pick up because they had The Simpsons and Married with Children. They started like investing in it. Rupert Murdoch obviously started that company.
I had never heard of Fox until they bought the NFL.
But then they got the NFL and they took off. Well, the CW was kind of like that. And like the shows that were on the CW were mostly for comic book nerds and teen girls. And they've done that for a long time. They sold to a new company. The new company says, well, we can't make money this way. So how do you make money in the 2020s? Well, you put on live sports. So what can we buy? And they went out and they got Live Golf, and then they got some college football, and then they got some more college football, and now they've got wrestling. So it's only going to grow. I think,
What is one of the things that we kept being told by, I forgot who it was, might have been even our good friend Jim in
North Carolina, yeah. Why are we blanking on his name?
Williams?
Jim Williams, I'm sorry, who brought up the fact that live programming, no matter what anyone wants to say, is a drug for all the networks. You need it, and that was one of the things that really, in the end, was a big deal for the Big 12.
Yeah, I think live sports is live sports, and there's not enough to quench the appetite. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw this when I was off. Like, I don't know how much y'all talked Olympics, but I watched a ton of it because I had time to. And the ratings from that and ratings from some of the day baseball games and some of the other events, like there's now the talk is, should we move more stuff to weekdays, like sports events? Should we move more stuff to weekdays? That's what's now being looked at by some of the networks after the success of the Olympics and just some other like baseball games and things that have aired and had pretty WNBA games that have aired during the daytime. I've had good ratings. So, yeah, the CW was easy to make fun of because I'm sure there's a Pac-12 fan watching this somewhere going, wait a second, y'all poo-pooed all over the CW and all that. I mean, as an extra element to what you already have, if you already have a deal with ESPN or, that's ABC, same thing, or whatever your arrangement is, I don't think you'd want it to be your main spot. But, yeah, as an accompaniment to a deal or as an add-on, then, yeah, I think that's a fine network for some games to be played, and I think that'll be an interesting spot to see how they cover it this year. So, yeah, I don't think that's the last we've heard of the CW in college football by any means.
All right, let's go to some more stories today. This young man, Daniel Jackson, wide receiver at Iowa State, is out for the year with a leg injury. I don't know if you guys know his story. He's like right there in the depth chart as their third or fourth guy. He is the one that when he was in high school had a massive car accident when he was driving 70 miles an hour, had his navel cavity broken, and basically almost
Nasal. His nasal cavity.
That's what I said.
You said navel.
You said naval cavity.
Well, no, not the one in your stomach. The nasal cavity broken, and he came back from near death. I mean, seriously, it was a bad deal. And but he's out for the year. That's tough news for Iowa State when it comes to their wide receiving corps. They have some good ones, Noel and a few others that are all really, really good.
Yeah, Jalen Noel is a really good player, and that room is solid. I don't think, statistically this is a huge loss for them, but he did have his best year last year, and so that's really unfortunate. Regardless of what he did previously, that's just unfortunate in general. That's like the fifth or sixth season-ending injury that I've heard about in the last couple weeks already. And so, I hate that for Daniel Jackson, and, I hate that for Iowa State.
We'll go to some others here in a moment. That was that. Let's get to some things from Brett McMurphy. When yesterday's Associated Press preseason top 25 poll came out, last night he went like Adderall with these thoughts. Which top 10 team will finish unranked every year for the past 21 years, except 2019, there has been at least one preseason top 10 team that finished not out of the top 10, finished out of the poll, including last year, USC, with Caleb Williams and Lincoln Riley. Who will it be possibly this year?
At first glance, that's a really tough question because you look at the current top 10, and there's not a lot of just like, oh, yeah, there's the G5 they gave a little bit too much credit to or something along those lines. I'm kind of leaning towards Michigan, although I think they're going to be pretty solid, even though you've lost J.J. McCarty, and we don't know about Orji and how all that's going to look and everything, but I kind of lean them like that, plus the coaching change, just losing some big-time players, having the great run that you did last year. But I could be convinced that it's Penn State. I think that's where my eyes also went as well, was Penn State. Beyond that, I do wonder about FSU having a hangover just from last year and losing a lot of talent, but I feel like they have a manageable conference, and Mike Norvell is a really good coach because they're sitting there right there at 10. Beyond those two, though, like I'd expect – I don't feel confident in saying that any of those teams are like, I can see them falling out of the top 10, but I could see it with Penn State and Michigan potentially.
Yeah, I agree with you. Look, you could convince me that Florida State could again have a hangover and hit the wall, and they've got a fairly decent schedule when you've got Memphis and SMU and Clemson, Miami, Notre Dame in Florida on it, and we don't know how good Florida is going to be, but it's still a rivalry game. But I just think that they're good enough to where they won't fall out. Like they may not be in the playoff, but I don't think they'll fall out of the top 25. But Notre Dame, Penn State, and Michigan, and even Notre Dame doesn't have a schedule that's tough enough outside of catastrophe for me to think they would fall out of the top 25.
Yeah, and I was sitting here thinking about it as the top 10. Now that you're saying that, it's like, oh, yeah, his tweet said top 25. So top 25.
No, completely unranked.
Yeah, no.
From top 10 out of the top 25 completely.
I think my answer's the same.
Yeah, Penn State and Michigan to me would be the most. But then again, like Penn State's schedule, are you going to lose that many games when
they have right now on their schedule ranked teams? Again, that doesn't mean anything until they start to play games. They play USC and Ohio State are the only ranked teams. Now, they open up with West Virginia. We wonder how that goes, but they have two ranked teams compared to some who have 6, 5, a bunch have 6.
Yeah.
Ranked teams.
And I'll tell you about West Virginia, in my opinion, and I hope this isn't just Big 12 bias, and our West Virginia friends haven't put a worm in our brain. But if I had an AP vote, I would have given West Virginia won before USC right now.
Okay.
Because
yeah.
I know more about them.
I would for sure. I feel much better about West Virginia than I do about USC. I do think that West Virginia fans, God love them, have tried to plant those thoughts and have been very vocal about the disrespect they're getting this preseason.
Nothing like when they say disrespect, it's completely almost like a complete flip of compared to last year's disrespect. They're getting.
Yeah, no, I do think that they are in a weird spot where people are putting their top 25 polls together, and West Virginia is not necessarily an automatic Big 12 top 5. And so if they're not a Big 12 top 5 in people's minds because you think Kansas is and Kansas State's better and you think Utah's better and you think Arizona's better, whoever, then there's not much room for you to be in a top 25. Like if you're the 6th best Big 12 team, you're probably not in the top 25, just the way that it's going to start out at least. So, yeah, I think you're right that it's probably a bit overblown, but it is a total reversal from last year where it was like, God, are we about to tear this whole thing down and we better win enough games? And now it's like, why are we not in the top 25 after the year? And so, yeah, I'm very curious about them and what they actually turn into because it could be way this direction or way the other direction. I have no idea.
It's every year, 21 years except 2019. Here's some more. Here are the coaches that have been on the unranked list of teams started ranked in the top 10 who did not finish ranked, including Riley, Aranda, Venables, his first year, I believe, Mac Brown, Dan Campbell. Remember they were coming off that Matt Campbell. Boy, I'm with names today. There's Franklin at Penn State, Cristobal at Oregon, Malzahn twice at Auburn, Kelly at Notre Dame, and then Lane Kiffin at USC in 2012. So those are the coaches who had a team in the top 10. They didn't rank them in the top 10, but they were ranked in the top 10 who finished unranked at the end of the season. Also, Brett McMurphy. This is another one. Here's teams that started unranked that ended up in the top 10. Last year, it was Missouri. There has been at least one team every year for 30 years, except 11 and 20 COVID year, which started unranked, and they did the opposite. Ended up in the top 10. Last year, Missouri ranked at the end of the year number 8.
Yeah, Missouri was the story of the year out of nowhere to me because everybody like, okay, well, Mizzou's kind of Mizzou, and then from that, from the beginning of the season on, you kind of thought like, oh, this may be a little bit different. Who's this Brady Cook? Man, Luther Burden, he really is that good, And then they, Cody Schrader had an unbelievable year, kind of out of nowhere. So yeah, it was unbelievable. So it was great. Yeah, that's who they were.
Yeah, as far as who could possibly do that this year, I mean, just looking at some of the others receiving votes: Louisville, Vautech, Boise State, SMU, Iowa State, go a little ways. West Virginia got 17 votes. Memphis, so I could see one of those schools doing that.
In the top 10?
Yeah, like if Memphis with their road compared to others, if they actually turn out to be as good as believed, then they could be that top G5 qualifier.
Yeah, they would be a top 5, but they would have to basically run the table to be in the top 10. We're not talking ranked. We're talking in the top 10.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying if there's possibilities there, like that's a better bet than thinking that I don't know, that Louisville's going to end up in the top 10 in my opinion. But I mean, there's always the chance, obviously, as you showed with history there. But yeah, I think that's possible again this year. Yeah, that's still quite a feat. I mean,
it's crazy.
I'm looking at Nebraska's getting votes, and I guess I could see it, but man, it's really hard in the Big Ten this year. Like they'd have to be really good. Same with Wisconsin. So yeah, I think it's easier if it's a Boise State or someone like that. But there's some interesting candidates.
Georgia, number 1, right? Makes a lot of sense. I don't think anyone was surprised with that. 18 of the last 20 Associated Press preseason number 1 ranked teams did not. 18 of the last 20 did not win the national title, including Georgia a year ago. Alabama and USC overcame the preseason number 1 jinx, and USC had that great run that, in fact, was ended in 2005 by Vince Young and company. These trends are crazy. And Brett, I sent him a text. I said, man, you are full of some great nuggets today. And so that would be, and okay, 18 of the last 20, the number one ranked team did not win the national title. It's hard, first of all, but you would think it would be more than just 2 of the last 20.
Mm-hmm. Well, if Georgia does it, they'll be the greatest team of all time.
I mean, yeah, absolutely.
I don't know why they wouldn't be, and the whole they weren't undefeated. That's not going to fly the same way anymore because you're playing in a totally different game under totally different rules in a totally different era with a totally different setup. So, yeah, they didn't win all 12 regular season games and then win their bowl game that had no ties to anything. They had to win most of their games during the regular season, like 10 of them at worst, and then maybe 9, it's the SEC, and then go win 4 more games against top 12 teams. I mean, that's whoever does that is going to be a pretty special group.
UT parking, by the way, on teams that may not be ranked that could end up in the top 10. He mentioned Georgia Tech and Virginia Tech. A couple of teams to think about in the ACC.
Yeah, the ACC.
TCU and Tech.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of teams that aren't in that top 25. So, yeah, absolutely. I can see TCU doing that. If they turn out to be as good as Sonny Dykes seems to think that they could be, if Josh Hoover's really that guy and they're better defensively. So, yeah, I mean, I think all those teams you mentioned are certainly in the mix.
All right, here's another note. Ohio State, ranked number 2. It's the 18th time in their school history that they've been ranked number 2 in the preseason poll. 6th time in the last 9 years. They've never won the national title when they started the season ranked number 1 or number 2.
Huh.
Again, it's hard.
Well, yeah, but again, look, it's different now. It's different because you're
You would think these things are going to be harder to do.
Yeah,
right?
it's going to be harder, or like it's not as. Part of the reason you don't win a national title when you start the season ranked number 2 is you get upset and you have a precipitous drop. Well, now you'll still be able to get in the playoff, provided that doesn't continue to happen.
Well, if you play a good team early,
okay. I'll just put it this way, Smokey, just to tease you because I want to put it in your brain. But say Ohio State is rolling along, and then they play that game against Nebraska, and Nebraska decides, well, this is the time we're going to look like we've developed, and they beat them. Well, in the past, that number 2 Ohio State team would have dropped precipitously, and that game would have followed them around all year long. But if they lose to Nebraska now, and
could you have just used another example?
No, I wanted to mess with you. And then go through the rest of the season, everything's fine. Even if they lost in the Big Ten title game, they're going to be 10-2 and. Or
they would be 11-2.
11-2. They're going to be 11-2 and in the playoff. So what does it matter that you had that other one and you dropped from 2 to 8? Because 8's still fine. Mm-hmm. As opposed to we're stuck at number 8. All of our dreams are crushed. That's over.
Yep. All right, one more. Texas at number 4, ranked in the top 5 for the first time since the year after they lost to Alabama in the national championship game. When the Longhorns started number 5, they finished unranked in 2010. Now, having said that, there are years they've started inside the top 5 and finished, and in fact played really, really well and won a national title. But at number 4, the highest they've been since 2010, that was the Garrett Gilbert year that didn't go very well. And Texas ended up being unranked. Craig, you brought up some injuries, and this is UT has lost another running back. Freshman Christian Clark has sustained what is believed to be a serious lower leg injury, not an ACL. This is from Anwar, but considering now moving yet another receiver into the running back room. And so, yeah, they had C.J. Baxter and now Christian Clark, and so 2 of their top, I think, 3 or 4 running backs are now out for one out for the year, 1 for an extended period of time. Oklahoma wide receiver Jaden Gibson out for the rest of the year. He is out. That was a story from Parker Thune. He is now out. Another player we mentioned earlier, the Iowa State wide receiver. So there's a lot of attrition already going on here in just the month of August.
Yeah, there is. I mean, that's really unfortunate that guys are getting this close and then unable to make it to the start of the season just a couple of weeks away. That really sucks. Jaden Gibson had a really productive year last year, and was a guy who I think you had some pretty good and high hopes for entering this season after not having a crazy amount of yards, but had a handful of touchdowns. He started the bowl game against Arizona. So, I mean, ended on – they didn't end on a high note as a team, certainly, but, ended with the start in that game. And, I think, just expecting more of that from Jaden Gibson. So that's tough. And then with UT and that running back room, when you start talking about having to move guys around, you mentioned Darian Gullett yesterday, switching over from defense potentially. That's rough. And especially when you walked in, you thought that, if anything, running back's a never-ending strength for Texas. But, one or two injuries, and that can throw the whole thing for a loop. So I don't think you really want, no matter how talented a true freshman might be, unless it's like Bijan Robinson or Adrian Peterson or something, I think you necessarily want your true freshman back having to get too many carries, but we'll see what is headed Christian Clark's way potentially. But, you got to be careful with that room, because one more injury and you're really up S Creek for Texas.
You're going to have to play some walk-ons.
Yeah, they can't lose Jaden Blue. No matter how much talent, what they have to try to move people around. Let's skip the Utah tight end room, Garrett, for a little bit later in the show. This was the one we saw from a week ago, the Jim Harbaugh note. No longer will be the honorary captain for the game against Fresno State. His mother and father will be there instead. Craig, you were going to add something else?
I wanted to add something to the Texas thing real quick. This is opening the door, though, for Trey Wisner. And so I feel really good about him. I feel absolutely great about him, knowing what we know about him as a player, how silky smooth he is. So I think you're just going to see more Trey Wisner because of some of these injuries, which I think you're going to see some of him anyways because he's just talented. But I do think like a local tie-in in a way is this is opening for even more carries for Trey Wisner.
And with that offensive line, they're not perfect, but with that offense being so open and
they're back in mass.
Their offensive line's close as well.
They're not perfect.
No, but
I'm just saying they have so much space available, and Trey Wisner can run like the wind.
Yeah, so I think for fans of his that this is actually a blessing in disguise potentially, and maybe it doesn't affect that at all, but he's who I think of now, because you're getting into that point of the depth chart of like there's only so many options, obviously, when you're moving guys from defense or you're adding a baseball player to the roster and Nick Anderson. That's where we look there. But to Harbaugh, I just wanted to close that.
No, the Harbaugh will no longer be there as an honorary captain for that game. I don't know. They can say whatever they want. It was not a good idea, in my opinion. Even if you love Michigan and you love Harbaugh, that was just not a good idea. And so now it's going to be his parents. He's going to he needs to focus on the NFL.
Nick Sanders, Texas running back, not Nick Anderson. Nick Anderson plays for Oklahoma. But yes, with Harbaugh, that is a situation where I can't believe they had the gall to even try to like really even test that, but they were clearly testing it and got the response that they probably should have expected to begin with. And, that's not a good idea. That to me is just throwing middle fingers in the face of authority, which I'm not opposed to when it's deserved, but I don't think Michigan deserves to do that. I think Michigan got very lucky that the whole situation turned out the way that it did. So count your blessings rather than trying to, like, take it another step. I think it's a good idea to not necessarily have Harbaugh involved there.
All right, just a couple other notes. We got a break. Come back with our opening guest. We'll have today at 3:40 with Carter Carls, it's a hard name, he even told me it was, who covers A&M for 247 Sports. Bruce Feldman, Deion Smith, the JUCO product, was at one point set to join LSU, right? Began his career with the Tigers. He is now with Ole Miss and apparently having a spectacular run early on, wowing the coaching staff, including Lane Kiffin.
Well, this is something, and I feel like maybe I'm outside of Mississippi proper. I'm the one who's been ringing this bell for Ole Miss. I kept hearing, I don't know about their depth. They've got like 10 of the top 25 JUCO prospects on the roster right now. Deion Smith, is that it? Deion Smith being the top one. Like that, getting him was a huge, huge deal. And then across other positions, they've killed it in JUCO. And people have kind of forgotten about that because we're all obsessed with the transfer portal. But you know what the transfer portal was before the transfer portal? It was JUCO. That was what it was. You went and a kid didn't work out at a place and he went to JUCO, or, he had grade issues and he went to JUCO, or, needed to eat a couple of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and he went to JUCO, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, we missed out on this dude. So, that's what it was before. So none of that's really changed as far as the talent that winds up there, that hasn't changed. The same kind of people have the same kind of situations and wind up there, and Lane Kiffin is the one who's using it the most.
Yeah, that's a really talented player that they've finally gotten cleared and can officially, prepare to have on the field, which is great news for Ole Miss and great news for that offense. And I think Jackson Dart's got a lot of fun toys to play with this year, and they certainly went all in budget-wise based on all the moves they've made this offseason. So you talk about a team starting off the top 10, be unranked. I think certainly the Pearls would get clutched, and there would be all sorts of extreme reactions if Georgia somehow wasn't in the top 20. But, if Ole Miss isn't in the top 25 by the end of the year, I think that would be as disastrous as anything, given how much they pushed their chips to the middle of the table this season. So that's another sign of positive talent in their direction, which they had a lot of here over the course of this past year, and all that talent, how that shapes up and actually performs. I think that's one of the more intriguing storylines because they're one of the more interesting teams entering this season because of all they went and did with their personnel. So yeah, that's another weapon to watch out for if you're the SEC.